Hi and welcome. Ex-husband invited his ex-wife to humiliate her at his wedding, but she showed up with twins and turned the tables. The next morning, Maria woke with a sense of purpose that felt almost electric. As she prepared breakfast for Diego and Carlos, her mind was already working through the logistics of what she'd privately begun calling Operation Vindication. Floyd's wedding was in exactly 3 weeks. Enough time to orchestrate the perfect entrance, but not so much time that she could second-guess herself. "Mom, you seem different today," Diego observed, looking up from his cereal with the sharp perception that had always made him an exceptional student. Excited, different. Did something big happen with Elegancia events? Maria smiled at her intuitive son. "Something like that, Miko. How would you and Carlos like to attend a very elegant, very important wedding with me?" Carlos's eyes lit up with curiosity. "What kind of wedding? Do we know the people getting married?" "It's a very formal affair. Black tie, 500 guests at the Grand Belmont Hotel. You'd need to wear tuxedos and be on your absolute best behavior around some very wealthy, powerful people." "Tuxedos?" Diego straightened in his chair, suddenly looking more like a young businessman than a 10-year-old. "Like at the charity galas we attend with you." "Exactly like that, but even more formal. I need to know you can handle yourselves with complete dignity around people who might be judgmental." Carlos, always more sensitive to emotional undercurrents, studied his mother's face carefully. "Mom, is this about something serious? You look like you do when you're preparing for a really important business presentation." Maria knelt down to their level, recognizing that her sons deserved more honesty than most children their age could handle. But Diego and Carlos weren't typical children. They'd been raised in circumstances that had forced them to mature quickly. "Boys, you remember how I've always told you that your father chose not to be part of our lives before you were born?" Both boys nodded solemnly. "Well, this wedding is his wedding. He's getting married, and he invited us to attend." Diego's expression sharpened with an understanding beyond his years. "He invited us after all this time. Why?" I think Maria said carefully. "He wants to show us how successful he's become. He probably expects us to look impressed, or maybe even sad that we're not part of his life. But we're not sad," Carlos said matter-of-factly. "We have a great life. Why would we be sad about missing out on someone who didn't want us?" Maria felt a surge of pride at her son's emotional intelligence. "You're absolutely right, and that's exactly what I want him to see. That we're not sad, we're not struggling, and we don't need anything from him." Diego leaned forward, his dark eyes so much like Floyd's, but filled with a warmth Floyd had never possessed, showing keen interest. "So this is like proving a point?" "Something like that. I want him to see who we are as a family. I want him to understand that his opinion of us was wrong." "Are you nervous?" Carlos asked, always attuned to others' emotions. Maria considered the question. "No, sweetheart. I'm not nervous anymore. I'm ready. Then we'll be ready too," Diego declared with characteristic confidence. "We'll be the best-dressed, most polite kids there, and we'll make you proud," Carlos added, reaching for her hand. That afternoon, Maria closed her office early and picked up Elena for what she thought of as a reconnaissance mission. They drove to the Grand Belmont Hotel where Maria had arranged to meet with the event coordinator under the pretense of considering the venue for a high-profile client event. Mrs. Saavedra, Rebecca, the event coordinator, greeted them in the opulent lobby with genuine warmth. Maria had worked with Rebecca on several occasions, and their professional relationship had evolved into mutual respect. "Thank you for considering the Belmont for your client. Let me show you our premier ballroom. It's actually being set up for a major wedding this weekend, so you can see it at its most formal." Perfect, Maria thought. The ballroom was breathtaking in its opulence. Massive crystal chandeliers, silk draping in ivory and gold, and round tables set with the finest Waterford crystal and sterling silver. White orchids and roses in elaborate arrangements created stunning centerpieces, and a string quartet was rehearsing near the raised platform where the head table would be positioned. "This is the Shorts' wedding," Rebecca explained proudly. 500 guests, unlimited budget, full black tie affair. Mr. Short spared no expense. Ice sculptures, premium doper and champagne, and we even have the governor's security detail coordinating with our team. Maria nodded appreciatively while mentally cataloging every detail. The het's elevated position would give Floyd and his bride a perfect view of the entire room and ensure that every guest would see whoever made an entrance. The curved staircase leading into the ballroom was designed for dramatic arrivals, guaranteeing that anyone descending those steps would capture everyone's attention. "The cocktail reception will be in the Rose Garden," Rebecca continued, leading them outside to a beautifully landscaped terrace overlooking the city skyline. "Weather permitting, of course, though the forecast looks perfect." As they toured the facilities, Maria's strategy began to crystallize. She would arrive during the cocktail hour when guests would be mingling outdoors, giving her room to establish her presence among the crowd before the formal dinner. The entrance down that dramatic staircase would ensure maximum impact when she and the twins made their way to the ballroom. "This is absolutely stunning," Elena murmured as they concluded the tour. "Are you sure you're ready for this level of spectacle?" "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," Maria replied with quiet conviction. The following Saturday, Maria and Elena embarked on what Elena had dubbed Operation Transformation Phase 2. Their first stop was Nordstrom, where Maria had an appointment with Patricia, a personal shopper she'd worked with for several important business events. "I need something absolutely spectacular," Maria told Patricia. "Black tie, wedding guest, and I want to make an unforgettable impression. This is probably the most important entrance I'll ever make." Patricia's eyes lit up with the challenge. "What's your budget?" "Whatever it takes to be perfect," Maria said without hesitation. 3 hours later, they had found the ideal dress, a stunning midnight blue gown by Oscar de la Renta that hugged Maria's figure perfectly before flowing into an elegant train. The color was sophisticated and dramatic, bringing out her dark eyes and complementing her olive skin tone beautifully. The design was unmistakably expensive and current, clearly the work of a master designer. "Maya, you look like you should be on the red carpet," Elena breathed as Maria emerged from the dressing room for the final fitting. "That's exactly the look I want," Maria replied, studying herself in the three-way mirror. This wasn't just a dress. It was armor. Confidence made visible. The twins were easier, but no less important to outfit properly. At the formal wear shop, Diego and Carlos approached the task of selecting tuxedos with the seriousness of young men who understood the importance of the occasion. "Do we look like we belong at a fancy wedding?" Carlos asked, adjusting his bow tie in the mirror with careful precision. "You look like young gentlemen," Maria replied proudly. "But remember, how you behave will be just as important as how you look." "Don't worry, Mom," Diego said confidently, standing straighter in his perfectly tailored jacket. "We know how to handle ourselves at formal events. We've been doing it for years." He was right. Thanks to the charity galas, business dinners, and cultural events Maria had taken them to as part of their education, both boys were comfortable in formal settings and knew how to interact with adults with appropriate respect and confidence. The week leading up to the wedding, Maria threw herself into preparation with the same intensity she brought to her most important business deals. She scheduled appointments with her hairstylist and makeup artist, arranged for a luxury car service, and even hired a photographer to document their preparation. She wanted pictures of this transformation. But more than the external preparations, Maria spent time preparing mentally and emotionally. She practiced potential conversations with Floyd, imagined various scenarios, and steeled herself for whatever reaction her appearance might provoke. "Are you nervous?" Elena asked as they sat in Maria's living room the night before the wedding, going over final details one more time. Surprisingly, no, Maria replied honestly. I feel peaceful, like I'm finally getting the chance to close a chapter that's been open too long. Elena studied her sister's face in the lamplight. You've really changed, not just since Floyd left, but even in the past few weeks since you got that invitation. You seem powerful. Maria considered that assessment. I think I finally understand something that took me 10 years to learn, which is Floyd's opinion of me never mattered. It was never about whether I was good enough. For him, it was about whether he was good enough for me. And the answer to that question is very clear now. Elena smiled. Those boys of yours are lucky to have you as their mother. I'm the lucky one, Maria said, glancing toward the stairs where Diego and Carlos were sleeping. They saved me. Having something so precious to fight for made me stronger than I ever knew I could be. As they finalized the last details, Maria felt a deep sense of completion settling over her. Tomorrow wasn't about revenge or even vindication. Really, tomorrow was about truth, showing Floyd exactly what he'd chosen to throw away, and proving to herself that she'd not only survived his cruelty, but had transformed it into something beautiful. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and warm. Maria woke early and began the process of transformation with the methodical precision of a general preparing for the most important battle of her career. The hairstylist arrived first, creating an elegant chignon that was sophisticated without being overly formal. The kind of hairstyle that whispered rather than shout at its expense. The makeup artist followed, enhancing Maria's natural beauty with a subtle glamour that would photograph beautifully under the ballroom's lighting. When it was time to dress, Elena helped Maria into the midnight blue gown, carefully arranging the train and adjusting the delicate shoulder straps. The dress fit like it had been made for her, highlighting every curve while maintaining perfect elegance. The jewelry was the final touch. Diamond earrings she'd bought herself to celebrate, Elegantia Event's 5th anniversary, and a matching pendant that had been her gift to herself when the twins were accepted at St. Mary's Academy. Each piece represented a victory, a milestone achieved through her own determination. Boys, Maria called upstairs. Time to get ready. Diego and Carlos appeared in their tuxedos, bow ties perfectly straight, hair neatly combed with just enough natural wave to look effortless. They looked so handsome and grown up that Maria felt tears threatening her carefully applied makeup. Do we look okay, Mom? Carlos asked, a hint of nervousness finally showing. You look perfect, Maria said, meaning it completely. You both look like the incredible young men you're becoming. Diego straightened his shoulders, assuming the posture of confidence that came so naturally to him. Are you ready to show everyone who we are? Maria looked at herself and her sons in the full-length mirror one final time. The woman looking back at her bore no resemblance to the broken, desperate person Floyd had discarded 10 years ago. This woman was confident, successful, and surrounded by love. Yes, she said firmly. I'm ready. As their car service arrived precisely on time, Maria felt a strange sense of completion. For 10 years, she'd been building toward this moment without even knowing it. Every late-night studying, every business success, every proud moment with her sons had been preparing her for this confrontation. Floyd thought he was inviting the old Maria to witness his triumph. Instead, he was about to meet the woman she'd become in his absence and discover exactly what he'd been foolish enough to throw away. Let's go show someone what a terrible mistake looks like, she said quietly as they settled into the car. Tonight, Floyd Short would learn that some people don't stay broken. Some people rebuild themselves into something stronger, more beautiful, and infinitely more valuable than what they'd been before. Chapter 7. The Grand Entrance. The Blacktown car pulled up to the Grand Belmont Hotel at precisely 7:15, fashionably late, as Maria had planned. Through the tinted windows, she could see elegantly dressed guests mingling on the rose garden terrace. champagne glasses catching the golden light of the setting sun. Laughter and conversation creating the perfect backdrop for high society at play. "Are you ready, boys?" Maria asked, checking Diego and Carlos one final time. Both twins sat straight in their seats, looking remarkably composed for 10-year-olds, about to attend what was clearly the social event of the season. "We're ready, Mom," Diego said with a quiet confidence that reminded Maria of herself before important business presentations. "Remember what we practiced: firm handshakes, eye contact, and pleased to meet you when introduced to adults." Carlos nodded solemnly, his more sensitive nature showing in the careful way he adjusted his bow tie. "And we stay close to you unless you tell us otherwise. We're representing our family tonight." Maria's heart swelled with pride. These weren't just well-behaved children. They were young gentlemen who would hold their own in any company, regardless of wealth or social status. Floyd had no idea what he'd missed by abandoning them. The driver opened their door, and Maria stepped out first. The midnight blue Oscar de la Renta gown flowed around her like liquid silk, and she could feel the subtle shift in energy as nearby guests noticed her arrival. She was no longer the uncertain young woman who'd once felt intimidated by fancy venues and wealthy people. Tonight, she belonged here more than most of the guests inside. Diego and Carlos flanked her on either side, their matching tuxedos perfectly tailored, their bearing confident but respectful. Together, the three of them looked like what they were, a family of substance and success who had earned their place in any room. Mrs. Cedra, the Metro Day Robert, greeted her with genuine warmth and recognition. "What a pleasure to see you again. Your work on the Sinclair merger celebration was absolutely magnificent." Maria smiled, remembering the several high-profile events she'd coordinated at this hotel over the past 2 years. "Thank you, Robert. We're here for the Short Williams wedding, of course. The cocktail reception is in the Rose Garden, and dinner will begin in the main ballroom at 8. May I say, you and your young gentleman look absolutely stunning this evening." As they walked through the hotel's opulent lobby toward the garden terrace, Maria caught glimpses of herself and the boys in the mirrored walls. They looked like they'd stepped out of the pages of a luxury lifestyle magazine. Elegant, confident, and clearly accustomed to this level of sophistication. The moment they stepped onto the terrace, Maria felt the ripple effect that always accompanied a truly dramatic entrance. Conversations didn't stop up abruptly, but there was a subtle shift in energy, a turning of heads, and the kind of curious attention that successful, beautiful people naturally command. "My goodness," she heard a woman whisper to her companion. "Who is that stunning woman with those handsome boys? They look like they should be in a magazine." "I don't recognize them," another voice murmured. "But they're clearly somebody important. Look at that dress. That's Oscar de la Renta, if I've ever seen it." Maria accepted a champagne flute from a passing waiter and surveyed the crowd with practiced ease. She recognized several faces from her own professional and social circles: politicians, business leaders, cultural figures she'd encountered through elegancia events or her community involvement. These were Floyd's people now, the elite circle he'd always aspired to join. What Floyd didn't realize was that many of these people were also Maria's people now, earned through her own merit rather than marriage. "Maria Cedra," a familiar voice called out, and Maria turned to see Senator Morrison's wife approaching with obvious delight. "I had no idea you'd be here. You look absolutely radiant, my dear." "Mrs. Morrison, how lovely to see you," Maria replied warmly. "Allow me to introduce my sons, Diego and Carlos." Both boys stepped forward with perfect manners, offering polite handshakes and warm smiles that immediately charmed the older woman. "What delightful young men," Mrs. Morrison said, clearly impressed by their poise and confidence. "Are you enjoying your summer break from school?" "Yes, ma'am," Diego replied with easy confidence. "We're looking forward to starting 6th grade at St. Mary's Academy in the fall. This summer, we've been helping our mother with some of her charity events, St. Mary's, excellent school. My grandson attends there as well. Mrs. Morrison turned back to Maria with curious interest. I didn't realize you knew the bride and groom. Maria's smile didn't waver, though she could feel the weight of careful attention from nearby guests who were clearly listening. I have a connection to the groom from years past. I thought it would be appropriate to attend his celebration. As Mrs. Morrison moved on, Maria noticed more familiar faces beginning to approach, but not with the cautious curiosity she might have expected. Instead, they came with the warmth reserved for respected colleagues and friends. Mrs. Saavedra, another voice called out, and Maria found herself greeting Dr. Patricia Valdez, the mayor's chief of staff. I didn't expect to see you here. How wonderful, Dr. Valdez. What a pleasure. I was just telling my husband about the exceptional job you did coordinating our foundation's gala last month. The logistics alone were incredible, but the way you made everyone feel welcomed and valued, that's what made the evening truly special. More introductions followed in rapid succession. The president of the Chamber of Commerce, whose annual dinner Maria had organized, Judge Harrison, whose daughter's wedding had been one of Elegancia Events' signature successes, and 3 prominent businessmen whose corporate events she'd coordinated with flawless execution. Each interaction served to establish her presence and status among the wedding guests. To these people, she wasn't some unknown party crasher. She was Maria Sidra, the successful entrepreneur they'd worked with professionally and come to respect personally. "Mom," Carlos whispered during a brief lull in the introductions. "Everyone seems to know you and like you. I've worked hard to build relationships in this community," Maria replied softly. "Tonight, that work is paying off in ways I never expected." From across the terrace, she caught sight of Floyd for the first time in 10 years. He was holding court near the fountain, surrounded by a group of men in expensive suits, all laughing at something he'd said with the kind of appreciative attention that successful, charismatic men naturally attract. At 38, Floyd was still undeniably handsome. His dark hair now showing distinguished touches of silver at the temples, his physique maintained by what were probably expensive personal trainers and carefully controlled nutrition. He wore success like a perfectly tailored suit, and his confidence bordered on the kind of arrogance that comes from never being seriously challenged. But as Maria watched him from across the crowded terrace, she felt absolutely nothing. No flutter of old attraction, no pang of regret or longing, no anger or bitterness. He was simply a stranger now, someone from her past who no longer had any power over her emotions or self-worth. Floyd hadn't noticed her yet, but several people in his circle had begun glancing in her direction with obvious curiosity and what looked like growing recognition. The whispered conversations were spreading through the crowd like ripples on water as word traveled about the elegant woman and her remarkable sons. "Floyd, darling." A high, breathless voice cut through the ambient conversation, and Maria saw Stephanie Williams approaching, Floyd's group with the kind of dramatic flair that suggested she was accustomed to being the center of attention. The bride-to-be was undeniably beautiful, tall, blonde, and perfectly groomed in the way that only unlimited money and professional styling could achieve. Her pre-wedding cocktail dress was clearly designer, probably costing more than most people's monthly salary. But there was something brittle about her beauty, something that suggested it required constant maintenance and validation to sustain itself. Stephanie whispered something in Floyd's ear, gesturing discreetly in Maria's direction with the practiced subtlety of someone accustomed to social maneuvering. Maria watched as Floyd's expression shifted from casual attention to sharp focus, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed directly on her. The moment their gazes met across the crowded terrace, Maria saw Floyd's face transform completely. First confusion, as if he was seeing a mirage, then recognition, followed by what could only be described as shock as he took in her elegant appearance and obvious comfort in these expensive surroundings. This was clearly not the broken, desperate woman he'd expected to see. This was not someone who could be dismissed or pied. This was a woman who obviously belonged in this world of wealth and influence, who commanded respect and attention in her own right. But it wasn't until Floyd's gaze shifted to Diego and Carlos, standing confidently beside their mother like young princes, that Maria saw true comprehension dawn in his eyes. Diego, with his strong jaw and natural authority, was unmistakably Floyd's son. The resemblance was so strong it was almost startling. The same bone structure, the same way of holding his shoulders, the same inherent confidence. Carlos, gentler but equally poised, carried Floyd's distinctive features softened by Maria's more delicate bone structure. There was no question, no possibility of doubt. These were Floyd Short's children, raised to be exceptional young men, despite, or perhaps because of, his complete absence from their lives. Maria watched Floyd's face go visibly pale as the full implications hit him. These weren't just any children attending the wedding. These were the sons he'd rejected, the burden he'd refused to acknowledge. And they were clearly thriving, clearly loved, clearly being raised with advantages and opportunities he'd never imagined they'd have. "Holy shit," she heard someone near Floyd mutter, and she realized that others in his group were beginning to notice the resemblance as well. Stephanie tugged on Floyd's arm, saying something that looked urgent and increasingly panicked. But Floyd seemed frozen in place, staring across the terrace at the family he'd abandoned. Maria decided it was time to take control of the situation. With Diego and Carlos beside her, she began walking slowly across the terrace toward Floyd's group. Conversations parted before them like water, and she could feel every eye in the garden following their progress. With fascination and growing understanding. "Boys," she said quietly as they approached, "I want you to meet someone who's been very important in our story, even though he wasn't part of our lives." Diego and Carlos maintained their composure, but Maria could sense their heightened attention. They knew this moment was significant, even if they didn't fully understand all the implications. Floyd's group had gone completely silent, watching this elegant woman and her striking sons approach with obvious fascination and dawning comprehension. "Hello, Floyd," Maria said when they were close enough for normal conversation, her voice warm but controlled, carrying clearly in the sudden quiet that had fallen over their section of the terrace. "Thank you for the kind invitation to your wedding. It's been enlightening to see how well some people have done for themselves." Floyd opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. Up close, the resemblance between him and the boys was even more pronounced and undeniable. Diego had Floyd's exact jawline and the same distinctive way of tilting his head when listening. Carlos had Floyd's dark eyebrows and the same elegant hands. "These are my sons," Maria continued smoothly, her voice carrying with perfect clarity. "Diego and Carlos. Boys, this is Mr. Short, the groom. We came to congratulate both." The boys stepped forward with the impeccable manners Maria had taught them, offering polite handshakes and appropriate greetings. But Maria could see Floyd's hand trembling as he shook hands with Diego, his eyes searching the boy's face with growing recognition and what might have been the first stirrings of regret. How old are they?" Floyd asked, his voice thick with shock. 10, Maria replied calmly. "They'll be 11 in February. Twins, as you can see." The math was simple enough for everyone present to calculate instantly. 10 years ago, Floyd would have been married to Maria. These children would have been born during or just after their marriage. Stephanie's eyes widened as she looked between Floyd and the boys, clearly beginning to understand the situation with growing horror. "Flutie," Stephanie said slowly, her voice rising with disbelief. "Are these?" "Yes," Maria answered for him, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet that had fallen over not just their group, but most of the terrace. "These are Floyd's sons, the children he chose not to be part of their lives." The silence that followed was deafening. Around them, other guests were beginning to pick up on the drama unfolding. Whispered conversations spreading the revelation through the crowd like wildfire. Floyd looked like he'd been struck by lightning, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. Stephanie appeared to be in complete shock, her perfectly made-up face frozen in an expression of horrified realization. But Maria felt only a deep sense of satisfaction and completion. This was the moment she'd been building toward for 10 years. Not to destroy Floyd, but to show him exactly what he'd thrown away through his own cruelty and short-sightedness. "Congratulations on your wedding," she said graciously, her voice carrying across the increasingly quiet terrace. "I hope you'll both be very happy together." As she turned to walk away with Diego and Carlos, Maria heard Stephanie's voice rising behind them in what sounded like the beginning of a very public and very heated argument. The evening was just beginning, and already Floyd's perfect wedding was starting to unravel in the most spectacular way possible. Chapter 8: The Revelation. As Maria walked away from Floyd with Diego and Carlos beside her, the elegant cocktail atmosphere of the Rose Garden began to shift into something far more intense and dramatic. Behind them, Stephanie's voice was rising with each word, sharp with confusion and growing outrage. "Floyd, what is she talking about? You have children. You told me you'd never been seriously involved with anyone before me." The whispered conversations that had started around Floyd's group were spreading through the crowd like wildfire, creating an undercurrent of excitement and scandal that transformed the wedding reception into something resembling a public tribunal. Maria guided the boys toward a quieter section of the terrace near the fountain, where they could observe without being in the direct center of attention. But even as she moved away from the confrontation, she could feel the weight of hundreds of curious gazes as word spread through the assembled guests with the speed that only truly explosive gossip could achieve. "Mom," Diego said quietly, accepting a glass of sparkling cider from a passing waiter. "That man, Mr. Short, he looked like he'd seen a ghost when he saw us. In a way he did." "Mijo," Maria replied, watching the drama unfold across the terrace. "Sometimes people are surprised by the consequences of their choices." Carlos, ever the more emotionally perceptive of the twins, looked thoughtful as he studied the growing commotion around Floyd. "Are you okay? You seem different. Strong but different." Before Maria could answer, Mrs. Morrison appeared at her elbow, her face flushed with excitement and barely contained indignation. "My dear," she said in a stage whisper that carried clearly to nearby guests, "is it true? Are those boys Floyd Short's sons?" Maria nodded calmly, maintaining her composure despite the intensity of the moment. "Yes, they are." Mrs. Morrison's expression shifted from curiosity to genuine shock. "But I had no idea he'd been married before, and such handsome, well-mannered boys. They're clearly exceptional children." The conversation was drawing attention from other guests who were trying to look like they weren't, eavesdropping while obviously hanging on every word. "How long were you married?" asked Dr. Valdez, who had appeared as if drawn by the magnetic pull of developing scandal. 3 years, Maria replied evenly. "We divorced when I was pregnant with the twins." A collective gasp rose from the growing circle of listeners. Dr. Valdez's professional composure cracked as she processed the implications. "He left you when you were pregnant with twins?" Floyd made his position very clear, Maria said with measured calm. "He wasn't interested in being a father." "Good Lord," breathed Judge Harrison, who had joined the growing audience. "That poor girl over there is about to marry a man who abandoned his pregnant wife and newborn children." Across the terrace, the drama was escalating rapidly. Stephanie's voice had risen to a pitch that was carrying clearly across the entire garden, and Floyd looked increasingly desperate as he tried to explain or defend himself to his bride and the growing circle of shocked guests surrounding them. "You abandoned your pregnant wife?" Stephanie's voice cracked with disbelief and growing hysteria. "Floyd, how could you not tell me something like this? How could you lie to me for 2 entire years?" "It's complicated." Floyd's voice carried across the crowd, sounding weak and defensive. You don't understand the circumstances. Complicated? Stephanie's laugh was sharp and broken. What's complicated about being a decent human being? What's complicated about taking care of your own children? Maria watched as more prominent guests began to gravitate toward the confrontation, drawn by the spectacle and clearly horrified by what they were learning about Floyd's character. Senator Morrison pushed through the crowd, his political instincts recognizing a moment of public judgment. Is this true, Floyd? Did you really abandon your pregnant wife and children? They weren't. I mean, the situation was Floyd was stammering now, looking around desperately for support that clearly wasn't coming. The situation was that you called me nothing and walked away from your pregnant wife. Maria's voice cut through Floyd's attempted explanation, carrying clearly across the increasingly quiet crowd. She hadn't moved from her position by the fountain, but her words reached every corner of the terrace. A visible shudder ran through the assembled guests as the full cruelty of Floyd's actions became clear. You called her nothing? Dr. Valdez's medical training was evident in the way she examined Floyd like a particularly disgusting specimen. A pregnant woman carrying your children, and you called her nothing. Mayor Valdez stepped forward, his political authority lending weight to his words. Floyd, I've supported your business ventures, attended your fundraisers, considered you a friend. How could you lie to all of us about something this fundamental to your character? I didn't lie. Exactly, Floyd said desperately. I moved on. I started over. You abandoned them? Stephanie shrieked. And now her voice was breaking with genuine emotional pain. What kind of monster abandons his own babies? What kind of psychopath leaves a woman alone and pregnant with twins? The crowd had grown larger and more hostile with each revelation. Maria could see cell phones appearing as guests began recording what was clearly going to be the scandal of the social season. Mrs. Cedra Harrison approached Maria with the kind of judicial gravity that commanded respect. I hope you don't mind my saying, but your sons are remarkable young men. I've been watching them handle this situation, and their composure is extraordinary. Thank you, Your Honor, Maria replied. They're the joy of my life. I can see why, the judge said, glancing toward the chaos surrounding Floyd with undisguised disgust. May I ask, and please tell me if I'm overstepping, but is it true that their father completely abandoned them? Floyd made it clear that he wanted no part of our children's lives, Maria said simply. So I raised them on my own. Judge Harrison's expression darkened with professional outrage. A man who abandons his children isn't much of a man at all, in my opinion. You've clearly done an exceptional job raising them without him. Dr. Patricia Hartwell, the city's most prominent pediatrician, joined their conversation with obvious indignation. I couldn't help but overhear. Those are beautiful, well-adjusted children, and they clearly adore you. Their father really left when you were pregnant. He made his choice, Maria said diplomatically, though her calm demeanor was making Floyd's actions seem even more reprehensible by contrast. And clearly it was the wrong choice, Dr. Hartwell replied firmly. Those boys are exceptional, and you should be very proud of the job you've done raising them. As more guests approached to express their support and admiration, Maria realized that Floyd's plan to humiliate her had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. Instead of appearing as the pathetic ex-wife he'd expected, she was being embraced by the very society he'd hoped to impress. The guests were seeing her as the successful, dignified woman she'd become, while Floyd was being revealed as someone capable of unconscionable cruelty toward his own family. Meanwhile, the confrontation between Floyd and Stephanie was reaching a crescendo. The bride-to-be had attracted quite an audience, her voice rising with each accusation as her perfect wedding day dissolved into public humiliation. You told me I was your first real love, Stephanie was saying, her perfectly styled hair beginning to come loose as she gestured wildly. You said you'd never been married before. You said you'd been waiting your whole life for someone like me. Stephanie, please let me explain, Floyd began. But she cut him off with devastating fury. Explain what? That you lied to me about everything? That you have children you never mentioned? That you abandoned a pregnant woman carrying your twins? Stephanie's voice broke completely. What kind of monster does that? What kind of person can look at a pregnant woman and call her nothing? Maria found herself feeling an unexpected moment of sympathy for Stephanie. However shallow the young woman might have seemed initially, she was genuinely shocked and hurt by these revelations. She was learning in the most public way possible that the man she was about to marry was capable of cruelty beyond her imagination. Look at them, Senator Morrison said, his politician's voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd as he gestured toward Maria and the twins. Look at those boys, Floyd, your sons. Look at what their mother accomplished without you. Diego stepped forward with remarkable poise for a 10-year-old. His voice clear and steady despite the chaos around them. Mr. Short, he said, and the crowd quieted to hear him. My mother told us you didn't want children. She said you chose not to be part of our lives. We turned out fine without you, Carlos added quietly. But his words carried like thunder in the stillness. Mom made sure we had everything we needed. We don't need anything from you now. The crowd murmured its approval, and Maria could see tears in several women's eyes as they watched these remarkable children defend their mother with such dignity and maturity. Children shouldn't have to be this strong, whispered Mrs. Patterson, the society matron whose opinion could make or break social reputations. They shouldn't have to protect their mother from their own fathers. Cruelty. Stephanie suddenly broke away from Floyd and walked directly over to Maria, tears streaming down her face, her wedding makeup ruined beyond repair. I am so sorry, she said, taking Maria's hands in hers, her voice breaking with genuine emotion. I'm sorry for what he did to you. I'm sorry I almost married such a monster without knowing what he was capable of. You're not responsible for his choices, Maria replied gently. And even in her grace towards Stephanie, everyone could see the fundamental kindness that Floyd had been too blind to value. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephanie announced, turning to address the crowd with the kind of dramatic flair that would be talked about for years to come. There will be no wedding tonight. I cannot and will not marry a man who could look at a pregnant woman carrying his children and call her nothing. I cannot bind my life to someone with such a complete absence of basic human decency. The silence that followed was broken by a single clap from Judge Harrison. Then Dr. Hartwell joined in, then Senator Morrison. Within seconds, the entire crowd was applauding Stephanie's decision, showing their approval for her rejection of Floyd. The sound of that applause, hundreds of the city's most influential people showing their support for Stephanie's decision to abandon Floyd, was devastating. Maria watched Floyd's face crumble as he realized that his entire social circle was not only rejecting him, but celebrating his abandonment. Stephanie, wait! Floyd called desperately as she began to walk away, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a symbol of his destroyed dreams. Please, we can work through this. I can change. She stopped and turned back, her face a mask of disgust and finality. Change, Floyd. You abandoned newborn babies. You left a woman alone with twins. There's no coming back from that level of cruelty. There's no redemption for what you did to your own family. As Stephanie walked away, her exit marking the official end of Floyd's wedding and social standing, the crowd began to disperse. But they didn't leave quietly. Each departure was marked by a public declaration, every guest making sure their rejection of Floyd was clearly understood. Don't contact my office about those zoning permits, Senator Morrison announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. I don't do business with men who abandon their children. The Morrison endorsement is withdrawn from all your projects, added his wife with equal volume. Consider our political relationship terminated. My medical practice will no longer use your properties for our charity events, Dr. Hartwell declared. We can't be associated with someone who abandons children. The mayor's office will be reviewing all city contracts with your company, Mayor Valdez announced with the authority of public office. The people of this city deserve better than to do business with someone capable of such cruelty. One by one, the most powerful people in the city lined up to publicly reject Floyd, but not before stopping to express their admiration for Maria and her sons. Mrs. Saavedra, you've raised remarkable children, Judge Harrison said, shaking Diego and Carlos's hands with formal respect. It's clear they've had an exceptional mother who taught them dignity and strength. Thank you for your grace tonight, added Mrs. Patterson, the society matron whose approval Floyd had always craved. A lesser woman would have caused a scene or sought revenge. You've shown extraordinary character. I'd like to discuss having Elegancia Events coordinate our foundation's annual gala, Senator Morrison said, his business card appearing in Maria's hand. After witnessing your composure and dignity tonight, I'm convinced you're exactly the kind of professional we want to work with. Floyd stood alone by the fountain where his engagement ring still lay forgotten, watching his entire life's work evaporate as the very people he'd hoped to impress rushed to embrace the family he'd thrown away. The contrast was brutal and undeniable. Maria, surrounded by respect and admiration, while he faced nothing but disgust and abandonment. As the crowd thinned and the last of the guests departed, Floyd was left with the wreckage of his wedding, his reputation, and his future. But more than that, he was left with the inescapable knowledge of exactly what he'd lost through his own cruelty and stupidity. The woman he'd called nothing had become everything that mattered, while he had revealed himself to be exactly that, nothing. Chapter 9. The Humiliation. The Grand Belmont Hotel's rose garden had transformed from Floyd Short's moment of triumph into the stage for his complete and utter destruction. As the last of the wedding guests departed, leaving behind only scattered rose petals and the echoes of his social annihilation, Floyd stood alone beside the fountain where Stephanie's engagement ring still lay forgotten on the stone patio. The silence was deafening after the chaos of the past hour. Floyd picked up the diamond ring, a 3-carat symbol of the life he'd thought he was building, and turned it over in his trembling hands. Just 2 hours ago, he'd been the groom at the social event of the season. Now he was a pariah, publicly rejected by his bride and condemned by every person whose opinion mattered in the city's business and social circles. Mr. Short, a hotel employee, approached cautiously. Sir, we need to begin cleaning up the ballroom. Dinner has been canceled. Floyd looked up at the young man, hardly recognizing his own voice when he spoke. Yes, of course. Send the bills to my office. But even as he said it, Floyd knew that his office might not exist much longer. The political and business connections he'd spent 15 years cultivating had evaporated in the span of a single evening. Senator Morrison's endorsement, Mayor Valdez's contracts, Judge Harrison's legal referrals, all gone, publicly withdrawn in front of hundreds of witnesses. 3 days later, Floyd sat in his lawyer's office staring at a stack of documents that represented the beginning of the end. His attorney, Marcus Webb, looked uncomfortable as he reviewed the papers spread across his mahogany desk. The Morrison family has officially withdrawn their political endorsement from all your development projects, Marcus said without preamble. The Riverside Heights project is dead in the water without their support. The city council won't approve the zoning changes. Floyd nodded numbly. The Riverside Heights development had been his flagship project, a $50 million luxury residential complex that would have cemented his reputation as the city's premier developer. What about the other projects? Marcus consulted his notes with the grim efficiency of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. The mayor's office has announced they're reviewing all existing contracts with Short, development for compliance and ethical standards. That's political speak for. We're looking for reasons to cancel everything. And Judge Harrison, he's already moved his family's legal work to Patterson and Associates. But that's not the worst part. Marcus leaned forward, his expression grave. 3 of your major investors called this morning. They're pulling out of the Jefferson Street project. They cited concerns about your personal character affecting the company's reputation. Floyd felt the room spinning around him. The Jefferson Street project was his company's largest undertaking, a mixed-use development that had required 2 years of planning and represented nearly 60% of his firm's projected revenue for the next 3 years. How much? Floyd asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. If Jefferson Street fails, you're looking at bankruptcy within 6 months. The investors want their money back immediately. $8.2 million. The bank is calling in your construction loans, and there's something else. Marcus hesitated, which was never a good sign from a lawyer who'd been handling sensitive matters for Floyd for over a decade. What? Your ex-wife's divorce settlement is being reviewed by the state attorney general's office. Someone, and I have my suspicions about who, filed a complaint alleging that you deliberately hid assets during the divorce proceedings 10 years ago. Floyd's blood ran cold. That's impossible. We disclosed everything, did you? Marcus' voice was sharp. Because I've been going through the old files, Floyd, and there are some discrepancies. The Patterson account, for instance. You had a significant trust fund from your grandmother that wasn't mentioned in the settlement. The Patterson account. Floyd had completely forgotten about his grandmother's trust. $200,000 that had been sitting untouched in a separate bank managed by a family friend. He'd convinced himself it didn't count because he'd never accessed it during his marriage to Maria. If they can prove you deliberately concealed assets, Marcus continued, Maria could be entitled to half of everything you owned, then plus interest and penalties. We're talking about potentially millions of dollars. Floyd slumped in his chair, understanding for the first time the full scope of his destruction. It wasn't just his current projects failing. His entire financial foundation was crumbling. 1 week later, the scandal had spread beyond the city's social circles into the business community with the devastating efficiency of a viral infection. The local newspaper society page had run a detailed account of the wedding disaster under the headline, Prominent Developer's Wedding, canceled after shocking revelations about abandoned family, but it was the follow-up story in the business section that truly destroyed Floyd's remaining credibility. Short Development faces multiple investigations, detailed the city's review of his contracts, the state's examination of his decade-old divorce settlement, and the exodus of investors and business partners who no longer wanted to be associated with his name. Floyd's phone, once constantly ringing with opportunities and invitations, had gone silent. His assistant had resigned, claiming she couldn't handle the negative attention the office was receiving. 3 of his most experienced project managers had been poached by competing firms who saw an opportunity to acquire talent at discount prices. Most devastating of all was the call from his banker, a man Floyd had considered a friend for over 8 years. I'm sorry, Floyd, Robert Chun had said, his voice genuinely regretful. But the bank's board met last night. We're calling in your loans. All of them. Robert, you know I'm good for the money. This is just a temporary setback. It's not about the money, Floyd. It's about reputation. The bank can't be associated with someone who, well, with what happened at your wedding. Our board includes several prominent women who were there that night. They were very clear about their feelings. Floyd had hung up the phone and sat in his empty office, looking out at the city he'd once thought he owned. The view was the same, but everything else had changed. He was no longer a player in this city's power structure. He was a cautionary tale. 2 months later, the bankruptcy proceedings had been swift and merciless. Floyd sat in a small conference room in the county courthouse, signing papers that liquidated the last remnants of his business empire. His lawyer, a court-appointed attorney, Since Marcus Webb had declined to continue representing him, handed him document after document with mechanical efficiency. The penthouse sold for $1.2 million, the attorney said without emotion. After outstanding mortgages and liens, that leaves approximately $300,000. The cars have been repossessed. Your investment portfolio has been liquidated to pay creditors. Floyd signed each paper mechanically, watching his life's work reduced to a series of legal documents and financial statements. What about the Patterson account investigation? The attorney consulted his notes. The state attorney general's office reached a settlement with your ex-wife's representatives. You'll be paying $850,000 in back support and concealed assets, plus legal fees. The payment plan extends over 5 years. Nearly $1 million to Maria, money she would probably use to expand her business or invest in her son's education. The irony was overwhelming. He would be paying for the success of the family he'd abandoned. Where do I stand financially after all debts and settlements are paid? You'll have approximately $50,000 to your name. No business assets, no real estate, no investments. You'll need to find employment. Floyd Short, who had once owned a multi-million-dollar development company, who had dined with governors and senators, would need to find a job working for someone else. 6 months after the wedding, Floyd stood in the lobby of Henderson and Associates, a mid-tier real estate firm that specialized in strip mall developments and small commercial properties. Exactly the kind of projects he'd once looked down on with disdain. He wore his last good suit, the only one he'd been able to keep from his former wardrobe, and carried a resume that felt like a confession of failure. Mr. Short. The receptionist's voice was professionally neutral, but Floyd could see the recognition in her eyes. Everyone in the city's real estate community knew his story by now. I have an appointment with Mr. Henderson about the associate position. Thomas Henderson was a man Floyd had once dismissed as small-time, someone who handled the projects that weren't worth a major developer's attention. Now Floyd was hoping Henderson would give him a chance to rebuild his career from the bottom up. "Floyd," Henderson said, greeting him with the kind of cautious professionalism reserved for fallen titans. "Thank you for coming in. Please sit down." The interview was humbling in ways Floyd hadn't anticipated. Henderson asked basic questions about residential development, commercial leasing, and project management, subjects Floyd had once known intimately, but hadn't needed to think about in detail for years. He'd become so accustomed to operating at the executive level that he'd lost touch with the fundamental skills of the business. "I'll be honest with you, Floyd," Henderson said at the end of their meeting. "Your experience is impressive, but your reputation is challenging. This is a small firm. We can't afford to be associated with controversy." "I understand," Floyd said, hating how desperate he sounded. "But I'm willing to start over. I'll take any position you have available." Henderson studied him for a long moment. "There's a junior associate position open. It's basically entry-level work. Property inspections, document filing, client follow-up calls. The salary is $45,000 a year." $45,000. Floyd had once spent more than that on a single vacation. But he nodded eagerly. "I'll take it. One condition," Henderson said. "You never mention your connection to this firm in any public context. No networking events, no industry conferences, no social media. You're here to work quietly and rebuild your professional reputation through competence, not connections." Floyd agreed, understanding that he was being offered a chance at redemption, but only if he accepted complete anonymity and professional humility. 1 year after the wedding, Floyd lived in a studio apartment across town from his former penthouse, in a building where the elevator sometimes didn't work, and the air conditioning was a luxury he couldn't always afford. His neighbors were young professionals just starting their careers, graduate students and service workers, people who reminded him daily of how far he'd fallen. Every morning, he took the bus to Henderson and Associates, where he spent his days conducting property inspections, filing documents, and making follow-up calls to clients about lease renewals and maintenance issues. The work was honest but mundane, the kind of detailed, unglamorous labor that kept the real estate business functioning but never made headlines. His colleagues were polite but distant. Everyone knew who he was and what had happened to him. He was a cautionary tale walking among them, proof that success without character was ultimately hollow and unsustainable. The hardest part wasn't the financial struggle or the loss of social status. The hardest part was the knowledge that he'd brought all of this on himself through his own cruelty and short-sightedness. Every evening as Floyd rode the bus home through the city he'd once thought he owned, he would sometimes catch glimpses of his former life, the buildings he'd developed, the restaurants where he'd once been a VIP, the social venues where he was no longer welcome, and occasionally he would see news of Maria's continued success. Her company had been featured in national business magazines. She'd opened a second office in the state capital. She'd been appointed to the mayor's Economic Development Council, the same council that had once sought Floyd's input and now refused to work with him. The woman he'd called nothing had become everything he'd once pretended to be. Successful, respected, and genuinely valued by her community. Meanwhile, he had become exactly what he'd accused her of being: nothing. Floyd Short had wanted to humiliate his ex-wife at his wedding. Instead, he had orchestrated the most complete and devastating destruction of his own life imaginable. And unlike the temporary setbacks that most people face, Floyd's fall had been so public, so tied to his fundamental character, that there would be no real recovery. He would spend the rest of his life knowing exactly what he'd thrown away and exactly what that moment of cruelty had cost him. Justice, it turned out, was far more thorough and permanent than revenge could ever be. Chapter 10: New Life. 2 years after Floyd's wedding disaster, Maria Cedra stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new executive suite, watching the morning sun illuminate the city skyline from the 30th floor of the Meridian Tower. The bronze nameplate on the reception desk now read Elegancia Events International. Maria Saavedra, founder and CEO. What had begun as survival cooking in a studio apartment had evolved into a luxury event planning empire with offices in 4 cities and clients across 3 countries. At 38, Maria embodied success in ways she'd never imagined possible during those desperate early years. But more than the material achievements, what filled her with the deepest satisfaction was watching Diego and Carlos flourish into remarkable young men who exceeded her highest expectations with each passing day. Mrs. Cedra, her executive assistant Catherine, appeared in the doorway with the morning schedule displayed on a tablet. The Forbes photographer is here for your cover shoot, and the reporter from Harvard Business Review wants to confirm your interview time for this afternoon. Send the photographer to the conference room, please. And remind me I need to leave by 3:30 for Diego and Carlos's debate tournament finals. The Forbes cover story was titled "The Phoenix Rises: How Single Mothers Are Building America's Next Business Empires." Maria was the featured entrepreneur, profiled alongside tech innovators and Wall Street executives as one of the country's most successful self-made businesswomen. But what made her story unique wasn't just the financial success. It was the complete transformation from victim to victor, from abandoned wife to industry leader. The Harvard Business Review interview was for a case study on crisis management and reputation building. Maria's handling of Floyd's wedding confrontation had become legendary in business schools as an example of how dignity and authenticity could triumph over attempted humiliation. "What's fascinating about your story," the Harvard professor had told her during their preliminary conversation, "is how you turned a moment of intended cruelty into the catalyst for unprecedented success. The guests at that wedding became your biggest advocates and clients." It was true. The society figures who had witnessed Floyd's public disgrace had not only embraced Maria personally, but had actively promoted her business within their exclusive networks. Within 6 months of the wedding, Elegancy Events had coordinated 3 gubernatorial campaign events, 2 corporate merger celebrations, and the city's most prestigious charity gala. But the real transformation had come in the months that followed. As Maria's reputation for grace, under pressure, spread beyond local social circles into national business networks, the Forbes photographer worked efficiently, capturing Maria in her element, consulting with her design team about an upcoming senator's daughter's wedding, reviewing expansion plans for the company's new West Coast office, and posing with the numerous awards that now lined her office walls. "Mrs. Saavedra," the photographer said as they wrapped up, "I have to ask, do you ever think about the man who tried to humiliate you at his wedding? Does he know how successful you've become?" Maria considered the question carefully. She'd learned to be thoughtful about discussing Floyd publicly, not out of concern for his feelings, but because she'd discovered that her success spoke louder than any words about revenge or justice. "Success isn't about proving someone else wrong," she replied. "It's about proving yourself right, about your values, your capabilities, and your vision for what your life can become." But privately, Maria did sometimes wonder about Floyd's current circumstances. Through the interconnected world of business and social connections, she'd heard fragments of his story: the bankruptcy, the criminal investigation into hidden assets, the fall from penthouse to studio apartment. Just last month, Elena had mentioned seeing Floyd at a bus stop downtown, looking older and smaller than Maria remembered. He was working for a small real estate firm now, doing entry-level work that probably paid less in a year than Maria's company earned in a week. The knowledge brought Maria no satisfaction. Floyd's downfall felt like a separate story from her success. His consequences were the result of his own choices, while her achievements were built on entirely different foundations. At 3:15, Maria left her office early to attend the most important event of her day: watching Diego and Carlos compete in the state championship debate tournament. At 12 years old, both twins had grown into exceptional young men, but their paths reflected their distinct personalities in fascinating ways. Diego had been elected student body president at St. Mary's Academy for the 2nd consecutive year, making him the youngest student in the school's history to hold the position twice. His natural charisma and ethical leadership had caught the attention of several prestigious high schools, including 2 that had already extended scholarship offers for his freshman year. Carlos had won the state middle school creative writing championship and had just been accepted into Georgetown University's summer program for gifted young writers, an honor typically reserved for high school juniors and seniors. His short story about family resilience had been published in a national literary magazine and was being adapted into a short film by a local film school. But more than their individual achievements, what made Maria proudest was their character. The boys had grown up understanding that success without integrity was meaningless, that kindness was more important than winning, and that family loyalty was the foundation of all other relationships. The debate tournament was held at the city's most prestigious private school in an auditorium filled with parents, teachers, and academic officials. Maria found her seat in the front row, where a small placard reserved her spot as parent of finalists Diego and Carlos Saavedra. The topic was economic innovation and social responsibility, and both boys were competing on different teams in the championship round. Diego argued with passionate conviction about the importance of ethical business practices, while Carlos presented a nuanced analysis of how successful companies could address social inequality. Watching them debate, articulate, confident, and deeply thoughtful about complex issues, Maria felt overwhelmed by pride and gratitude. These young men were becoming exactly the kind of leaders the world needed. Intelligent without arrogance, successful without selfishness, strong without cruelty. When the results were announced, Diego's team won first place, and Carlos's team took second. But what moved Maria most was watching the brothers congratulate each other with genuine joy, each celebrating the other's success without reservation or jealousy. "Mom," Diego said as they left the auditorium, his first-place trophy in hand. "Did you see Carlos's closing argument? It was incredible. He's going to be an amazing writer someday. And did you hear Diego's point about corporate responsibility?" Carlos added, beaming with pride for his brother. "He's going to change how businesses think about their communities." That evening, after celebrating at the twins' favorite restaurant, Maria tucked Diego and Carlos into bed in their beautiful home in Riverside Hills. The house had evolved over the years from a symbol of financial security into a true family sanctuary filled with photos of their adventures, awards from school achievements, and mementos from the life they'd built together. "Mom," Carlos said as she kissed his forehead, "can I ask you something I've been thinking about?" "Of course, sweetheart." "Do you think we would be different people if our father had stayed? Like, would we care about different things or have different values?" It was a mature question that showed Carlos's developing understanding of how circumstances shape character. "That's a profound question," Maria replied, sitting on the edge of his bed. "I think you might be very different. You might have grown up taking certain privileges for granted, or you might not have learned to value hard work and resilience the way you do now." Diego appeared in the doorway, clearly having been listening. "I think we're lucky he left," he said with the straightforward honesty that characterized him. "Not because we don't want a father, but because we got to see how strong and amazing our mom is. If he'd stayed, we might never have learned that families can be built on love and respect instead of just existing." Maria felt tears prick her eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Diego continued, climbing onto the bed beside his brother, "we learned that you don't have to accept being treated badly just because someone is family. We learned that real love means supporting each other's dreams, not tearing each other down." Carlos nodded seriously. "And we learned that success means being proud of who you are and what you've accomplished, not needing to make other people feel small." "When did you two become so wise?" Maria asked, pulling both boys close. "We had a good teacher," Carlos said simply. As Maria turned out the lights and headed to her own room, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. 12 years ago, she'd been broken, desperate, and convinced she was worthless. Tonight, she was the CEO of an international company, the mother of 2 remarkable children, and a respected leader in her community. Standing at her bedroom window, looking out at the city lights, Maria allowed herself to think about Floyd one more time. Somewhere out there, he was living with the consequences of his choices. Alone, diminished, having lost everything he'd thought mattered. But Maria felt no triumph over his downfall, no satisfaction in his suffering. She felt only gratitude for the journey that had led her family to this place of complete fulfillment and joy. Floyd had tried to define her as nothing. His cruelty had forced her to discover that she was everything. Everything he'd been too blind to see, everything he'd been too foolish to value, and everything he'd been too weak to deserve. The woman Floyd had discarded no longer existed. In her place stood Maria Saavedra, successful entrepreneur, devoted mother, and living proof that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating your enemies, but from building a life so meaningful and beautiful that their opinions become irrelevant. As Maria prepared for bed, she smiled at the thought of tomorrow. Diego had a student government meeting to plan a community service project. Carlos had a creative writing club and a mentoring session with a local published author. And she had a consultation with an international client who wanted Elegancia Events to coordinate a charity gala that would raise money for educational scholarships for children of single mothers. Life was full, purposeful, and completely her own. She had built an empire not through cruelty or manipulation, but through determination, integrity, and love. Floyd Short had called her nothing and walked away from the most precious things life had to offer. In the end, his cruelty had become the catalyst for her greatest triumphs, while his own choices had reduced him to exactly what he'd once accused her of being. Justice, Maria understood now, wasn't about revenge. Justice was about becoming so completely and authentically yourself that the people who tried to diminish you fade into irrelevance while you rise into everything you were always meant to be. The broken woman was gone forever. In her place stood Maria Saavedra, and she was magnificent.